January 13th, 2017. The World Wildlife Fund quotes Howie and Lauds' big cat rescue. A few hours before sundown on October the 18th, 2011, law enforcement officials in Zanesville, Ohio, received a strange 911 call. The neighbor of a man named Terry Thompson had spotted a black bear running loose on Thompson's property, then a large male lion. As police officials drove toward the scene, they began spotting other large carnivores. The area was residential, and there was a school soccer game happening nearby, so the officers were ordered to shoot the animals. By the following morning, they had killed 6 bears, 17 lions, and a slew of other wild creatures, including 18 tigers. Thompson had released all of them from their enclosures in his yard before committing suicide. The Zanesville incident was so bizarre and horrific that it made international headlines. But it was also a rude awakening to the fact that many people in the U.S. own exotic animals, including Panthera tigris. There are thousands of captive tigers throughout the country. You can find them in backyard enclosures, petting zoos, and even truck stops. They outnumber the tigers believed to remain in the wild today. And, beyond the problems their captivity poses in the U.S., it's putting their wild counterparts at risk. Lee Henry, World Wildlife Fund's Senior Policy Advisor for Wildlife Conservation, says she first became aware of the issue around 2006. I was working on World Wildlife Fund's traffic team at the time, Henry says. An organization called Save the Tiger Fund approached us and said, "We're concerned about captive tigers in the U.S. Nobody knows much about them. If we get some funding, could you do a study?" With the help of a consultant, Henry put together the first comprehensive report on tiger ownership in the U.S. The results of their research were jarring. Not only did there appear to be roughly 5,000 captive tigers across the country, but the vast majority of those cats, about 95%, were, like Thompson's tigers, privately owned. That total is just an estimate, Henry adds. No one can say for certain because the U.S. actually has no comprehensive system for monitoring the captive tigers. Instead, Henry found regulations that were patchy and riddled with loopholes. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, requires permits for certain activities that would normally be prohibited under the Endangered Species Act, such as breeding tigers or transporting them across state lines. But, at the time, the Fish and Wildlife Service exempted generic tigers with genes from multiple subspecies, from those rules. Generic tigers are basically mutts, for lack of a better word, Henry says. Since they aren't genetically pure, they don't have conservation value to the Fish and Wildlife Service. But most of the tigers in the U.S. are generic, so the Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't monitoring them. The USDA, meanwhile, required exhibitor license for tigers that were being shown to the public, whether for free or for profit, but not for tigers that people simply wanted to keep privately as pets. Many states banned private possession of big cats, but still exempted anyone with a USDA license. A handful of others allowed possession with a state-issued permit, and several had no barriers whatsoever. Those laws have enormous loopholes. USDA licenses are easy to get, and many people who apply for them are just pet owners trying to evade the state bans, said Howard Baskin. Baskin and his wife Carole run Big Cat Rescue, a 67-acre large cat sanctuary in Tampa, Florida, that's been operating since 1992. They currently shelter about 70 cats, including 12 tigers. Some came to the sanctuary from people who tried their best to care for the animals but didn't have the knowledge or resources to meet their needs. But then there are owners like Terry Thompson or the woman in Ohio who had 4 tigers and 2 lions and declawed and defanged many of them, Baskin says. She would chain them down and charge people thousands of dollars to receive big cat training experience. People kept getting hurt, so she lost her USDA license, but she kept doing it anyway. It was a horrible situation. We took in 4 of these cats at the request of the state after she abandoned them. Besides putting both cats and people in danger in the U.S., the regulations allowing such behavior also pose big problems internationally. A huge issue here is cub petting operations. People who breed tiger cubs so they can charge customers to pet them and take pictures with them, Baskin says. They can only use the cubs for a few months before they grow too big to be safe and lose their commercial value. Once that happens, there's no way to track where the cubs end up, and thus no way to make sure they aren't being sold illegally. Our concern is you have all of these adult tigers in the U.S. that are unwanted, said Henry. And not just because they're dangerous, they're also incredibly expensive pets. The traffic report estimated that it costs $5,000 to $6,000 a year to feed a grown tiger. And while there are some good sanctuaries like Big Cat Rescue in operation, most of them are full to overflowing, Henry says. On the other hand, the value of a tiger carcass in Asian black markets can climb as high as $60,000. For someone trying to get rid of a large tiger, Henry says, selling its parts on the black market could prove too tempting to resist. And the availability of those parts fuels demand for even more, which in turn drives continued poaching of cats in the wild. What's more, America's captive tigers have become a diplomatic stumbling block in efforts to end tiger farming in China and Southeast Asia. When the tiger farm issue is brought up in international meetings, fingers tend to get pointed at China, but China has repeatedly questioned why the U.S. isn't doing something about its own tiger problem. We need to figure out a better way to regulate the tigers in our own backyard so that the U.S. can continue to be a global leader in combating wildlife crime and help influence China, Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos to shut their tiger farms down, Henry says. Both World Wildlife Fund and Big Cat Rescue have been advocating for tighter laws that can better regulate captive tigers and halt the breeding of cubs for profit. In 2016, they saw two major victories. The first was an April decision by the Fish and Wildlife Service to scratch the generic tiger exemption from its laws, a change that more than 450,000 World Wildlife supporters had called for. Around the same time, the USDA enacted a ban on public contact with tigers under 4 weeks old, in response to a petition from World Wildlife Fund, Big Cat Rescue, and a coalition of other animal rights organizations. That was a step in the right direction, but we asked for a ban on all public contact, Henry said. However, the USDA is still considering further action in response to the petition. Yeah, that petition was filed in 2011 or 2012, and we're still waiting for them to act. She's hopeful about the outcome and about the pressure these new policies could put on other countries with tiger issues. And Baskin says Big Cat Rescue is advocating for a bill completely banning private ownership and breeding of big cats. So far, it's gained 82 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives, and Baskin expects the number to keep growing. And it has to over 300 now. Unfortunately, it may take more tragedies like Zanesville to really change these laws, Baskin said. I'm hoping it doesn't. There's no reason for people to keep tigers and other dangerous carnivores in their backyards. And this was from the worldwildlifefund.org magazine. And then in other news, yesterday I got my remote pilot's license to fly drones from the FAA. Woohoo! I'm legal! If you're enjoying my diary, please like, share, and subscribe. You can find other ways to connect to me over at bigcatrescue.org/Carole.Baskin.